Hello YouTube, today I'm going to be reviewing the book Three Kings by former Forbes magazine journalist Zack O'Malley Greenburg. The book tackles a lot of meaty subjects, but in my opinion the main thesis is that hip-hop is ultimately capitalist, and that may not be such a bad thing, as hip-hop was finally the black community's way of reaping the benefits of their culture and music that had been constantly stolen and appropriated from them. One of the most interesting aspects early on in the book is the part telling the story of the founding fathers of hip-hop, particularly Fab Five Freddy and his connection to the art world. The book starts with a foreword by the artist and explains his connection to Jean-Michel Basquiat, who went by the name of Samo as a graffiti and street artist in New York. Fab Five Freddy helped document the culture, and his involvement really helped solidify hip-hop as an important cultural movement. We can think of Fab Five Freddy as an ethnomusicologist, as well as a cultural producer himself, who helped direct some of the earliest hip-hop biopics with Wild Style, direct Snoop Dogg's first single, Who Am I, and was a presenter for Yo MTV Raps. Clearly, he was a pioneer and worthy of a book all himself. However, at the end of the day, this book is about the eponymous Three Kings, Diddy, Dre, and Jay-Z. The three of them have starkly different personalities, but all made it to the higher rungs of hip-hop all the same. Dr. Dre, being the oldest of the three, spanning different generations of music, was quite interesting. However, the average hip-hop head is already somewhat familiar with his story, even more so in recent years with the Straight Outta Compton movie, which came out before this book was published, but also more recently, The Defiant Ones. Arguably, these narratives are sanitized for public consumption. With this book, however, the author does his best to mention incidents that do not necessarily pose his subjects in the best light, such as the domestic abuse allegations from both Dee Barnes and singer Michelle. This also means talking about Jay-Z's drug-dealing past, and also Diddy's run-ins with the law, the latter who tries to exude a squeaky clean persona as much as possible. While the author doesn't shy away from these controversial topics, I was quite surprised by the lack of detail in regards to the Shine incident, where Diddy allegedly brought a gun to a New York City nightclub and had his security take the blame for it. As we all know, the end result of this kerfuffle was then up-and-coming bad boy artist Shine going away to prison for 10 years, and then later being deported to Belize. However, there was one incident regarding Diddy that made me take notice. As the Travis Scott Astroworld fiasco picks up steam in court, the detail of Diddy dealing with something similar piqued my interest. On December 28, 1991, Diddy and Heavy D hosted a charity basketball game at City College with members of Run DMC, Jodeci, and even Big Daddy Kane performing. The venue was sold out at 2,500, but had thousands waiting to get in outside. The crowd eventually became unruly and started to surge. Stop me if this sounds eerily familiar. Eventually, Diddy got slammed in the press for letting inexperienced subordinates handle key aspects of the event and didn't hire enough security. It's almost like history repeats itself. One interesting tidbit was Russell Simmons' involvement with both Rocawear and Sean John. Now, there wouldn't be either brand without Fat Farm paving the way and essentially making deals with the right distributors. The author makes an interesting point that now that hip-hop clothing has proven commercially successful, artists no longer simply want to make money, but want the prestige as well, as in the case with Kanye West. And just quickly, I'll give myself a pat on the shoulder here. Back in 2018, I wrote an article all about how brands have used hip-hop successfully. Well, one brand that came up over and over again in my research was Sprite, who had a long history of involvement in hip-hop culture. The book actually explains this phenomenon largely as the vision of one marketing exec in particular, named Daryl Coben, who specifically went to work for parent company Coca-Cola so long as he could work on the Sprite brand. This led to interesting developments, such as a unique Sprite commercial featuring rappers from multiple coasts and regions coming together to form Voltron, the mech show familiar to 90s kids in the post-East Coast, West Coast beef era.
This hip-hop culture of yours is making a big buzz, and I'm not feeling it.
Another interesting aside was the exploration into 50 Cent's business acumen. Much ado has been written about 50 Cent's business savvy, so much so that famed author Robert Greene went as far as to team up with the rapper to put out the book The 50th Law. The current book, however, features 50 as a potential fourth king, where the Queens native gets his own dedicated chapter. 50 Cent's business savvy is best remembered when speaking of his landmark deal with Vitamin Water. It is estimated that 50 Cent made $100 million after Coca-Cola acquired Vitamin Water from the company Glaceau. But it wasn't all sunshine and roses, as tensions rose between 50 Cent and former associates Dr. Dre and Jimmy Iovine, as Beats by Dre was the sole headphone company allowed in music videos for Interscope artists. 50 was clearly frustrated as he was trying to do his own thing with SMS Audio and eventually went independent. However, shortly after 50 declared bankruptcy, after getting into a beef with Rick Ross, 50 went too far in his beef, releasing a sex tape of Ross's baby mama, which sparked a lot of litigation. The Monster Cable Finesse. Before Dr. Dre made a deal with Apple Music, a deal with a behind-the-scenes player named Noel Lee, who owned the manufacturing company Monster Cable. And it was thanks to Noel that Dr. Dre eventually got his Beats by Dre headphones. Monster Cable was starting to build out Beats Music, which of course was the spark behind the idea of Apple Music, the streaming service we now know today. The author alleges that Apple's Tim Cook wanted Jimmy Iovine and Dr. Dre sort of as creative directors, and that's the real reason behind the acquisition of Beats Music. Not necessarily the product itself, but having the good doctor himself on retainer. Lee alleges he got screwed by building up the Beats brand only to get cut out of the Apple Music deal at the last minute. And one interesting quote here that I liked in the book was that only God and capitalism can tell us how much it's worth, referring to the Beats deal. But clearly, it was worth a lot. I personally feel that the author belabors the point a bit too much. I wasn't really a fan of his writing style. He seemed like a good reporter, but like the writing left me kind of wanting, I don't know, somebody who was a little more deft in his writing abilities. I will say he, based on O'Malley Greenburg's reporting, I do think he did very good reportage, and especially since he was dealing with kind of like sensitive information, obviously with the artist's finances, and obviously a lot of that was going to be hard to find. I would have appreciated maybe a little more. I mean, I say creative license, but obviously he can't make anything up. He's a straight reporter. That's kind of my qualm with it. I would kind of contrast that to another reporter I really like, is like Matt Taibbi, who, for his part, like he has done like straight reporting books as well, but he's a lot more interesting as a writer, whereas Zack O'Malley Greenburg's writing feels a little dry at times. And it's like, it's only because he's really writing about interesting subjects. Like when he talks about, Diddy and his lavish parties, that's really kind of like the most interesting aspect of the book. So when there's like less interesting things like Dr. Dre or Jay-Z, like business deals with Tidal, I mean, that was a little enticing when he talks about like the behind the scenes of Tidal. I found particularly fascinating. And he's going to like Zurich or whatever, like he's going to someplace in Europe to kind of find the deal behind the deal. One interesting tidbit was like Jay-Z. I really my respect for Jay-Z kind of grew from this. I already respect Jay-Z immensely, but one of the genius moves that the book explains is that Jay-Z essentially takes European brands and remarkets them in America as a whole new brand, which essentially he did with Ace of Spades, with the brand Armand de Brigac, or I'm not sure the exact pronunciation, but it was already an existing brand. He just remarketed the brand to an American audience and expanded on it after, him dealing with Cristal, and Cristal kind of rejecting hip hop culture obviously left a bad taste in Jay-Z's mouth. So I thought that was pretty interesting. But yeah, like there's a line where he's like, I could sell ice water during the wintertime. I could sell fire in hell. That's the kind of hustler that Jay-Z is. And it really does kind of prove itself. And there's that line on the Black Album where Jay-Z calls himself Che Guevara with bling on. And there is actually kind of like an aspect of that where you realize that, because Jay-Z, the impression that the general public gets of Jay-Z is like Jay-Z is the ultimate capitalist. But in a way, Jay-Z's capitalism is very much almost a fuck you to like white European culture in a way. So in a way, I kind of see what he's saying. It's like, well, we're going to, especially in the context of an African American making it out of, the public housing, the making it out of the streets, becoming epitome of a hustler and hustler culture, and him basically taking European culture and, you know, repurposing it for his own devices. I thought that was really interesting. Again, so like I thought that was particularly interesting for Jay-Z. Diddy, you know, with Diddy, because he had the making the band, Diddy was always been like kind of like a caricature. However, at the end of the book, he kind of says like with Revolt, Diddy is kind of like taking a step back and reflecting uh, at the type of entrepreneur that he kind of wants to be. So I don't know if this is influenced by like, you know, like Gary Vee, who, you know, says to kind of lead with empathy. So I don't know if he's being influenced by other entrepreneurs or other businessmen to, you know, kind of take this role. But Diddy's, you know, not making his employees go out and get, you know, cheesecake for 20 miles anymore. Like he's not that kind of boss anymore. At least that's what the author argues. So, yeah, overall, the book has some interesting behind the scenes. There is, and the book does, or the, it does kind of try to argue this, that if you read in between the lines, you can potentially figure out, you know, potentially what worked and what may be successful. One of the things that really impressed me was the idea of getting publicity, which is actually very, very, very important, right? So, I mean, to achieve anything, you gotta basically know how to attract publicity. Jay-Z in particular did this very well. You know, part of the reason why the founding fathers didn't really do well business wise wasn't because of their artistic talent. It was because they didn't understand the business side of things, but particularly they didn't understand how to attract publicity. Where Jay-Z did things, for example, like his acquisitions in a way, or partnering with Sprint, like his partnership with Sprint in itself was a publicity stunt when he was distributing, you know, Holy Grail Magna Carta through Sprint. His you know, obviously during the rollout for that, he was doing like performance art pieces, you know, references to Jean-Michel Basquiat. There was one song he was performing at a museum, for example, or at an exhibit. So that kind of sticks out to his mind. There was like another entrepreneur I remember who I believe the story goes that he was dressed in a gorilla suit. So, and this guy was a European who was very into hip hop culture, and he did that to attract publicity. He ended up getting funding from Coca-Cola, and then like a few years later, because he had built his reputation, he ended up getting funding from Pepsi Cola as well. And then Russell Simmons went to him to get the funds, so to get the bag, so to speak, right? So publicity, very important. The act of getting a publicity stunt. And so like, you know, Tidal isn't even called Tidal in was it Switzerland or wherever it is. There's like a parent company, so like people didn't know of Tidal. It went by another name. And so all of that kind of plays into the lore, if you will. So would I recommend this book? Overall, I would. It really depends what you're into. If you're looking for a good read in terms of like business, if you're entrepreneurial minded, I'm sure you will glean something out of it. If you're not, you could probably pass on it. It's, you know, again, this is very much arguing in favor of capitalism. At the end of the day, it's kind of saying like greed is good. But like I said in the beginning, in the intro, that in a way, this is kind of, you know, black artists reclaiming, you know, their music and making capital on their terms. So, you know, it in a way you could argue it is a net positive. Now, if you're just against capitalism altogether in sort of like a far left way, and, you know, just believe that socialism is, you know, the way, then I mean this book probably isn't for you. I'm somewhere in between. So like I said, like I think there's definitely good that the book kind of, mentions that capitalism has done for these artists, but they at the same time, you know, to be perfectly honest, a lot of these artists have made deals where they did exploit either situations or other people. So, you do kind of have to make, uh, you know, you have to make terms with that as well. So overall, I would say I would rate this book 3.5 stars. Again, check it out if you're, you know, not super anti-capitalistic and want a book about hip hop culture and why capitalism may or may not be a good thing. Peace.